Picture this. It began, as these things often do, with a wedding. A young king, not yet worn by time or haunted by memory, standing at the altar beneath gilded arches and flickering candlelight. The court swelled with expectation, faces painted in smiles and ceremony, as his bride walked toward him, draped in ivory and youth. It was the start of a dynasty, they said. A love match, a hopeful match, a necessary match, a queen to warm the palace halls, a wife to anchor the throne. But behind the smiles, time was already sharpening its blade, because this king, this man born into robes and silence, would not bury just one wife. He would bury many. Again and again, he would place a trembling hand on cooling skin. Again and again, he would watch the colour fade from their faces, the light leave their eyes. He would become something no king should be, familiar with death in the bedchamber, intimate with the stillness that follows final breath. It would begin quietly, a sudden chill, a cough, a fainting spell during a feast. At first, physicians would promise comfort, routine remedies, healing herbs, but then the whisper would come, she's failing, and the rituals would begin. The prayers, the isolation, the doctors, with furrowed brows and trembling hands. And then silence, each time silence. The palace walls would hold it all, the echo of sobbing through corridors, the smell of incense and illness, the rustle of black veils being unpacked once more. The crown never left his head, but his heart? That changed, hardened, or maybe cracked slowly, like ice under weight. And the people, oh, they watched. They mourned with him at first, but as one queen followed another into the grave, they began to murmur. Was it fate? Was it punishment? Was it something darker? Some spoke of curses, others of poison. A few dared to wonder if it was the king himself, grieving too well, moving on too quickly, standing too still at too many funerals. History rarely tells stories of royal grief. It writes of victories and treaties, conquests and heirs. But this story, this king, is different. His rule is etched in loss. Not the grand loss of empire or battlefield, but the private, intimate loss that rots from the inside out. And so we begin, not with coronation nor conquest, but with a hand slipping away beneath a bedsheet, and a man who will come to know that feeling all too well. Before the funerals, before the midnight vigils and the black armbands worn year after year, there was just a boy, a prince, a shadow tucked behind the throne, learning the art of silence. He grew up in rooms too large for childhood, in gardens where laughter echoed off marble statues, only to be hushed by tutors and duty. His father was a ruler of rituals, his mother a woman of unyielding formality. There was no chaos in his upbringing, no warm messiness. Everything was precise, like lace folded too tightly, pressed flat beneath glass. He was groomed for obedience first, command later, and as he grew into his bones and expectations, he learned one crucial lesson above all else, that kings do not cry. He watched his father rule not with affection, but with distance. Power to him was performance. Grief was weakness. So the boy learned to swallow emotion like medicine, bitter, necessary. He became quiet, observant, a presence rather than a participant. When the time came for marriage, it was spoken of as though it had already happened. The bride was chosen, her name inked onto the family tree, before either had exchanged a word. She was noble, of course, suitable, delicate in the way paintings are, beautiful, untouchable, unchanging. And to the outside world, they looked perfect. The young king and his bride, golden and still, like a portrait already framed. But they were not in love, not yet, maybe not ever. Still there was kindness, shared glances. She had a laugh like spilled sunlight, and sometimes he let himself enjoy it. She softened the corners of the palace, placed flowers in rooms long stripped of colour, smiled at servants, wrote letters in her own hand. She tried in ways the court would never notice, and maybe that effort began to open something in him, a memory of feeling, of presence, of being more than the robes he wore. For a brief time, there was peace, a fragile rhythm. They dined together, walked the gardens. She spoke of books and skies, and he listened, like a man learning how to hear. But then came the cough. It was small at first, barely a whisper, dismissed as nerves perhaps, or the chill of the palace halls, but it deepened. Days passed, the fever climbed, her cheeks flushed too brightly, her laughter weakened. He summoned doctors, he waited outside doors, and when they opened those doors again, she was paler, smaller, slipping. The first wife, the first loss. He did not scream, he did not fall to the ground. He stood beside her bed, quiet, still, watching as her breath became memory, and the crown on his head felt heavier than it ever had before. She died in the early hours, when the palace was still and the candles had burned low enough to leave the corridors cloaked in waxy shadow. The air was thick with camphor and lavender, the scent of hope when medicine has nothing left to offer. A single nurse whispered a prayer. The court physician closed his satchel with trembling hands, and the king, newly made a widower, stood unmoving by the bed, his face unreadable, as if carved from the same stone as the busts that lined the gallery outside. They told him it was quick, that she hadn't suffered, that her final breath was peaceful, but he had seen her fight it. He had watched her hands flutter, grasping for something just out of reach. Her eyes, once bright, had searched the ceiling, as if some invisible truth were about to reveal itself. And when she slipped into silence, it wasn't a graceful descent. It was a drowning. The palace reacted as protocol dictated. Black drapes hung from the windows. Court musicians were dismissed. Ministers arrived with solemn expressions and delivered rehearsed condolences. The mourning began immediately. But mourning for a monarch is theatre. There are robes to wear, appearances to give. Sorrow is managed like a public asset, polished for consumption. He played his part well, too well, some said. He did not wail, he did not retreat. He attended the service in perfect posture, his eyes dry, his lips drawn tight like stitching. He stood by the grave as if guarding it, and the people, watching from the distance, aloud to them, whispered among themselves. They called it fate, a tragedy, yes, but not unusual. Illness strikes without preference, and young queens are not immune. Yet behind closed doors, whispers grew bolder. One death is fate. But something in his stillness unsettled them. It was as if the grief didn't reach him fully, as if it floated above his head like incense in a vaulted chapel. Then came the stories, the way the queen had spoken of strange dreams in the final weeks, the way the king avoided her room in the evenings, emerging only when her breath began to falter, the way her ladies-in-waiting were instructed to remain silent, even as her condition worsened. They called it the quiet curse, not out loud, not in court, but among the servants, in the kitchens, behind tapestries where truth was less dangerous. A curse not cast by spell or malice, but by silence, by distance, by some unseen rot that clung to the royal bed, like mould in a sacred space. When she was finally gone, the king returned to his chambers, alone. He removed the mourning robe, folded it precisely, placed it on the chair beside the hearth, and stared into the fire until morning. Not crying, not speaking, just watching, as if daring the flames to offer some answer. But they didn't, and neither would time. This was only the beginning. Grief in the royal world has a shelf life. A king might bury his heart, but the court will not wait beside the grave for long. There are treaties to sign, lands to secure, heirs to produce. And so, even before the candle wax had been fully scraped from the stone chapel floor, whispers of marriage began to echo through the halls, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. A throne cannot remain cold, nor a bed unfilled. The machinery of monarchy demands a queen. He was not ready, but he nodded anyway. They brought portraits, flatteringly painted, carefully lit, noble daughters from foreign courts, some with eyes the colour of spring, others with bloodlines tangled through centuries of European power. He examined them with the detachment of a man selecting drapery. Beauty was irrelevant, so was affection. What mattered was diplomacy, temperament, womb. He chose quickly, or perhaps she was chosen for him, a princess with calm features and an obedient smile. She arrived with chaperones and perfumed trunks, her steps rehearsed, her curtsies exact. On paper, they were perfect, but paper does not hold sorrow, and his was still folded tightly in the seams of his clothes, stitched beneath his skin. The wedding was grand, of course, they always are. Bells rang across the capital, the church was draped in gold and ivory, choirs sang of promise, of renewal, of love reborn, but beneath the crown his hands trembled. He said the vows in a voice carved from obligation, and when he kissed her, it was a gesture more diplomatic than devotional. The new queen tried. She spoke softly, asked gentle questions, touched his hand with hesitation, but he remained unreachable. Nights were spent in separate rooms. Conversation stayed shallow. He wore grief like armour, even as he smiled for the court painters. And she, young, isolated and watched, began to understand that her marriage was not to a man, but to a shadow. Still, the world moved forward. There were state dinners, portraits unveiled, the occasional staged outing to a garden. On balconies they waved together. At banquets they dined side by side. But in the private hours, those slow, creaking moments after the candles were snuffed, she was alone. And so was he, haunted not just by the woman he'd lost, but by the cold fact that even in her absence, she occupied more space than the woman who had replaced her. And somewhere deep in his chest, a question began to grow. Was this what life would be now? A cycle of silence and ceremony, a crown passed between coffins and contracts. He tried not to answer it, but he would, in time, because love does not protect kings, and grief left unspoken only prepares the body for more. The second death was quieter than the first, not in suffering, but in expectation. The palace no longer scrambled when the queen began to cough. The servants moved with a rehearsed calm, the doctors arrived without haste, and the king. He did not ask questions this time. He simply waited. It had started the same way. A faintness in her step, a flush to the cheeks that lingered too long, whispers behind her as she left the dining hall early. But no one panicked, not even her, perhaps because they all already knew how this would end. She was younger than the first, but more fragile, built for grace, not endurance. She bore the weight of the crown delicately, like a dancer balancing a teacup. And when the sickness took hold, it took everything quickly. Her strength, her appetite, her laughter. The sparkle in her eye, that had once tried to break through his silence, dimmed until it vanished entirely. The king sat by her bedside this time, every night. He did not speak much, he never had, but he stayed. And she noticed. In her fevered whispers, she would sometimes reach for his hand. He let her. Not out of love, not anymore, but perhaps out of guilt. Or maybe he had learned that presence, however hollow, was better than absence. As her breath shortened and her skin grew damp and translucent, the kingdom waited. Ministers whispered of succession plans, advisors drafted condolences, and newspapers speculated, with black-bordered headlines already typeset in advance. The people mourned her before she died, and when it happened, when the last breath passed slow as fog beneath a door, the king did not flinch. He simply stood, smoothed her hair once, and left the room. He did not wait for the body to cool. The ceremony that followed was immaculate. Black horses, velvet drapery, choirs echoing beneath cathedral arches. The streets were lined with mourners, though their eyes held more curiosity than sorrow. 2 queens gone in quick succession. Was it sickness? A curse? Was it something darker? They asked, but they never asked too loudly. Behind palace walls, the king became something else. Not broken, hardened. His steps grew heavier, his expressions fewer. He dismissed half the court in the months that followed, claiming reorganization, but those who remained knew better. Grief had not consumed him, it had calcified him. And this time, the silence didn't just live in his private chambers, it spread through the entire kingdom. Because after the second queen died, people stopped calling it tragedy. They started calling it a pattern. She was different. Not royal by birth, not chosen by courtly decree or diplomatic negotiation. She came from gentler lands, fields and orchards, not palaces and portraits. A woman with earth beneath her fingernails and herbs in her satchel. They called her a healer, though some whispered more dangerous words, mystic, witch, commoner. But she walked with certainty, and her voice carried the kind of softness that makes powerful men lean in closer. He had not intended to love again. After 2 wives lowered into the ground, he had accepted the crown as both his burden and his companion. He was done with softness. He was done with hope. But grief, when left to rot long enough, turns into hunger. And when she arrived, called to the palace to tend to a noble's mysterious ailment, it wasn't her remedies that stirred him. It was the way she looked at him, like a man instead of a monarch. She didn't bow deeply. She didn't speak in rehearsed tones. She asked him if he slept, if he dreamed, if he ever walked alone through the gardens at night. And he did. He had. He found her again and again, in corridors, in the old library, where no one read anymore, in the greenhouse, where wilted flowers lingered. They talked, and in those conversations, he remembered something almost foreign, warmth. She made him laugh once, only once, but it felt like water to a man who had been choking on ash. No one approved of the match. His advisors warned of scandal. The church condemned it quietly, with downcast eyes and two formal phrases. But he didn't care. Or at least, he told himself he didn't. They married in secret, then in public, and the court seethed in silence. She was no queen, they said. She had no lineage, no bearing, no sacred blood. But the people liked her. She spoke to them without pretense, touched their hands when they offered flowers. She made the palace feel, for a time, like a place where human things could still happen. And then, just as the warmth returned, just as something resembling happiness took root, she fell ill. It began with fatigue, then bruises that would not fade, then nights soaked in sweat and breathless gasps. The court doctors dismissed her complaints. The king flew into rage after rage, demanding better, faster, more. But nothing came. Her decline was cruel, more violent than the queen's before her. Where they faded, she fractured, and in her final days, she screamed. He was there, every hour. But this time, there was no hand-holding, no comfort. He was useless beside her, a king with a crown that couldn't stop the blood pooling in her mouth. And when she finally died, the silence afterward wasn't ceremonial. It was total. Not just in the palace, but in him. The hollowness opened wider than ever before, and for the first time, he wondered if it was him, if death was following him not by fate, but invitation. They buried her on a grey morning. The sky hung low, thick with fog that clung to the spires like gauze over open wounds. The bells rang again, those same aching chimes that had tolled twice before. But now they sounded different, not mournful, ominous, as if even they were tired of repeating the ritual. A third wife, a third funeral, and a king who had stopped pretending to feel surprise. He did not weep, he did not speak. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, watching as the earth swallowed another piece of whatever was left of him. The court, now seasoned in this performance, knew their cues: black silks, solemn nods, eyes that glanced downward only when they dared not glance toward him. But the kingdom was restless. 3 queens, 3 deaths, in the span of just a few years. What once felt like misfortune now felt like design, or punishment. Rumours bloomed like mould. Was it poison? Was the king cursed? Had he brought ruin with his touch, his presence, his very name? Priests began to include subtle invocations in their sermons, warnings not just of sin, but of rot, the kind that hides inside the soul of a nation. The streets outside the palace grew quiet, not in reverence, but in apprehension. Inside the royal walls, no one dared speak freely. Servants whispered behind their hands. Ladies in waiting crossed themselves in corners. Courtiers exchanged glances over goblets of wine they no longer finished. And still, the king moved through the halls like a shadow dressed in velvet. He did not speak of her. Not the laughter she once gave him. Not the letters she left behind. Not the bruises that had begun to spread across her arms in the final weeks. It was as if she had never existed, except for the scent that lingered in the sheets. He refused to change. The world moved on, but the palace stayed locked in the same repeating nightmare. The advisors urged him to remarry. They always did. It was never phrased as desire, only duty. The need for heirs, the need for alliance, the need for something to lift the weight that was crushing the court beneath the sheer, unrelenting gravity of his loss. He nodded, eventually. He always did. But he didn't choose. Not really. The bride would be selected for him, as if chosen not for her vitality, but for her willingness to risk proximity to his fate. And somewhere in the silence that followed the third funeral, something shifted in him. Not grief, not guilt, but recognition. The understanding that this was no longer anomaly. This was pattern. And patterns, once recognized, do not simply end. They complete themselves, again and again and again. They began as murmurs in the corridors, soft as silk hems brushing against ancient stone, carried not by bold voices, but by sidelong glances and half-finished sentences. At first, no one dared say it aloud, not in full, but the silence around the king's wives had become too thick, too heavy to ignore. 3 queens lost, each fading in different ways, and yet ending the same. And still he ruled, untouched, intact. That was what frightened them most. In the servants' quarters, the cooks told tales over candlelight. One swore she'd seen a vial in the king's chamber, a dark glass bottle with no label, carefully corked. Another claimed to have overheard a court physician mutter that her illness didn't match the symptoms, and yet no investigation ever followed. No questions were asked. The palace kept its dead quiet. Among the clergy, the whispers turned darker. They spoke of divine punishment. Perhaps the king had sinned in secret ways. Perhaps the deaths were not man's doing, but God's. They scoured his bloodline, his coronation oaths, his confessions. Some called for exorcisms, others for prayer. But none could explain why, when he passed through the cathedral doors, the air grew colder. In the noble courts abroad, rumours were traded like currency. Some said he was cursed from birth, that a forgotten midwife had whispered a hex into his cradle. Others believed the queens had never died at all, that they had been hidden, locked away, driven mad in the palace dungeons to keep some dreadful secret. One ambassador wrote home, "The king smiles too little and mourns too neatly. I do not trust a man who buries 3 wives and still speaks in monotone." But the most persistent rumour, the one passed from hand to hand like contraband, was the quiet accusation of poison. Not the kind slipped in goblets, but something slower, something that changed with each wife, as if adapted, something laced in powder, in fabric, in touch. Perhaps not by his own hand, but by his command. Or worse, by something drawn to him, something hungry. And in this vacuum of truth, madness took root. Some believed the palace itself was sick, that the rooms where queens had once laughed were now infected, cursed with invisible rot. One chambermaid refused to enter the east wing after dusk, claiming the mirrors there never reflected her properly. Another fainted while folding sheets in the late queen's bedchamber, claiming she felt fingers brush her neck, cold and deliberate. The king, for his part, said nothing. He attended court as expected, gave orders, received guests, but behind his eyes something flickered, a tension, not of grief, but of endurance, as though he knew what they were saying, as though he had heard it all before, and perhaps he had, because in a palace built on ceremony and silence, truth was always a trespasser, and the halls were full of locked doors. At night, when the palace sank into hush, and the echo of footsteps finally faded from the stone floors, he stayed awake. He walked the halls like a ghost among ghosts, his own presence barely more real than the memories embedded in the tapestries. Shadows bloomed behind every candlelit alcove. Doors he no longer opened seemed to watch him, and always, just beneath the sound of wind through the rafters, there was the whisper of a breath that wasn't his. He had become a man, surrounded not by ministers and courtiers, but by absence, the kind that speaks, the kind that follows. Each chamber bore a different silence, the one where his first wife had sewn lace in the afternoons, the room where his second had once played the harpsichord, the notes still suspended somewhere in the air, the corridor where the third had screamed. He walked them all, every night, as if revisiting the wounds might make them heal, but they didn't. They never did. He began attending chapel more often, slipping in before dawn when the pews were cold and empty. He would kneel there, alone, fingers steepled, lips moving, but never forming full prayers. Not anymore. He no longer asked for mercy or comfort. He only asked for answers. And even those he knew would not come, because what answer could there be? He was not a cruel man, at least not in his mind. He had not struck them. He had not exiled them. He had watched them die, yes, but he had not killed. And yet death followed him like a loyal hound, obedient, unquestioning, ever waiting. He began to wonder whether grief was simply the cloak God had chosen for him, if sorrow was the garment of kingship, sewn thread by thread through every vow he had ever spoken. Perhaps his hands were not clean, not in the sense of blood, but in something worse, indifference, emotional cowardice, the sin of distance. He fasted more frequently. He read scripture by candlelight, searching not for hope, but for parallels, cursed monarchs, broken patriarchs, men abandoned by heaven for mistakes they could no longer remember. He lingered on the stories of Job, of Saul, of David, after Bathsheba. He wondered which name would match his fate. Some nights he wept, not loudly, not in confession, just quietly, behind the altar, where no one could see. But more often he did not weep at all, because if he let himself break, the kingdom might follow. And what terrified him most was not death, not ruin, not loneliness. It was that maybe, just maybe, he deserved it. Not for what he had done, but for what he hadn't. And no crown, no cathedral, no army of priests could cleanse a man of sins he didn't understand. She arrived in spring. The courtyard was still drying from a long wet winter, and ivy had just begun to reclaim the southern walls. The palace, despite everything, dressed itself in preparation. Floral arrangements, fresh banners, hurried servants, trying to remember what celebration felt like. But no one believed in the illusion. Not truly. Not even him. And yet when she stepped down from the carriage, everything stilled. She was older than the others had been. Not a child of diplomacy, or a pawn of dynastic chess. She carried no dowry of political leverage, no kingdom stitched into the hem of her gown. What she brought was harder to quantify. A calmness, a self-possession, the kind of strength that comes not from power, but from surviving its absence. The court had questioned the match. She wasn't royal enough, wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't young enough. But that, perhaps, was why she was chosen. The king no longer trusted pageantry. He wanted something unbreakable, or failing, that someone who didn't flinch. She didn't. In their first conversation, she asked about the gardens. Not his grief, not his legacy, just the gardens. What grew best here? What survived the winters? It was the first time he had laughed, softly but truly, in years. Their wedding was quieter than the last. Fewer guests, fewer vows spoken in public. He had insisted on privacy, and she, mercifully, did not ask for more than he could give. There were no promises of passion, no illusions of sweeping romance, just a shared understanding. He would not lie to her, and she would not pretend to be afraid. In the first weeks, something unfamiliar stirred in him. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but it was adjacent. He began to eat with her, walk with her, sit in the same room, even in silence, and not feel devoured by memory. She brought a steadiness that dulled the sharp edges of the palace. The staff noticed, the servants exhaled. For a moment the ghost seemed to retreat. He caught himself smiling once. He watched her tend to the sick in the infirmary, saw her hands pressed gently against a fevered child's head, and for the first time since the second funeral, he felt the terrible weight of wanting something to last. But hope, in his world, was a dangerous thing, because with hope came fear. And every cough, every skipped meal, every flicker of tiredness in her eyes felt like a prophecy. Still, he held on. He let himself believe, just a little, because even a haunted man will chase light when it finally flickers through the cracks in the stone. She began to fade in summer. Not in any dramatic way at first, just a weariness that lingered in her voice, a slowness in her step. The king noticed immediately. He noticed everything now. After 3 deaths, his senses had sharpened into cruelty. A fever became a storm. A fainting spell became a funeral dirge. But she dismissed it all, said it was nothing, said he worried too much. He didn't believe her, but he wanted to. So for a time he let himself pretend. He watched her sit in the garden with a book on her lap, eyes half closed in the sun. He watched her speak kindly to the chambermaids, to the gardeners, to the horses. The palace began to soften around her. It bloomed just slightly, as if reminded what warmth could feel like. And he was no longer just surviving. He was watching the world again, listening, breathing. They spoke of the future once, just once. It was late. The fire had burned low, and she'd said with a faint smile, "What if we grew old together?" Her voice didn't tremble, but his did. And for a moment he imagined it, age lines beside her eyes, white in her hair, the same hand in his for decades instead of months. He said yes. He didn't know if he believed it, but he said it anyway. Then came the bleeding, a sickness that did not announce itself with thunder, but with quiet, terrifying consistency. A cough that never left, bruises that bloomed without reason. The court physicians were summoned, then silenced. He had them replaced, then replaced again. He demanded prayers, alchemies, leeches, tonics, anything. He summoned every healer from every corner of the land. But the outcome never changed. She grew paler. He grew quieter. This time there were no midnight screams, no panicked servants, just the slow, relentless descent of a woman who had walked into a broken house and dared to love the man still standing inside it. She smiled at him even when she couldn't stand. She held his hand even when hers shook. And when she died, she whispered something he couldn't understand. But he carried it anyway, like a relic. The funeral was private, at his command. No parades, no mourning banners. He couldn't bear the performance, because this time he had loved her. And that made it different. That made it worse. He didn't speak for weeks afterward, and when he finally did, it was to ask a question that chilled every soul who heard it. Am I death dressed in gold? No one answered, because maybe he was, and maybe love, in his hands, would always rot. They wandered the palace like echoes of people who hadn't lived long enough to leave memories. Children born in mourning gowns, airs raised beneath portraits of the dead. Their laughter was soft, sparse, and never fully trusted, as if joy might summon another funeral. The court called them the little sovereigns, a bitter joke, small replicas of a monarchy that had forgotten how to rejoice. Daughters dressed in widow's black before they could speak. Sons taught to bow at altars that still smelled of incense from their mothers' requiems. There were no lullabies in the nursery, only prayers, whispered, half-believed prayers, as if God was just another courtier, too tired to listen anymore. The king rarely visited them, not out of cruelty, but out of terror. They reminded him of what he'd lost, and of what he might lose again. Every cough from a crib sent fear straight through him, like a sword. Every scraped knee felt like a prophecy, so he stayed away, watched from balconies, sent gifts, not affection, teachers, not embraces. He knew he was failing them, but love to him had become something sharp, something fatal, and he would not pass the curse forward. So the children were raised by ghosts, nannies who wore veils longer than their tenure, tutors who kept their voices low, as if shouting might summon a shadow, and other children, siblings, half-siblings, cousins, who all learned the same thing early. Their mothers had died, and no one knew why. Some had vague recollection, a scent, a song, a warm hand against fevered skin. Others had nothing, just names in the royal registry and oil portraits in rooms they weren't allowed to enter alone. They rarely spoke of it. They weren't taught to. Loss was not an event in the palace. It was a condition, a weather, a quiet, unspoken pressure in the lungs. When new children were born, no celebrations followed, no feast, no dancing, just hope, sealed in fear, like flowers pressed in books that no one read anymore. And yet they grew, some with bitterness, others with detachment. One prince refused to marry at all, convinced it would kill whoever he loved. A young princess once asked a bishop if heaven had royal titles, or if her mother had to sweep floors there. He couldn't answer. The court kept functioning, as it always had. Policies passed, banners flew, but the soul of it, the soul had thinned. Because a kingdom, ruled by a man who outlives love, becomes a place where childhood is haunted before it even begins. And in those marble corridors, lined with the faces of the departed, the children learned not to cry. They learned to whisper, to walk softly, to survive. The physicians came in robes, embroidered with gold, carrying vials that shimmered with tinctures from distant lands. They came with scrolls and solemn faces, muttering diagnoses, cloaked in Latin, as if language itself could obscure their failures. They bowed deeply, offered assurances, and each time left behind nothing but thinner queens and heavier air. They were summoned at every symptom, at the first sign of pallor, the first cough behind a closed door. The king's messengers rode through the night to fetch them. No cost was spared, no cure dismissed, no method too strange. He once allowed a healer to place leeches on his queen's chest in the middle of a lightning storm, the chamber reeking of copper and rain. He watched the blood drain and asked nothing, only stared at the floor, jaw clenched against hope. Still they died. And medicine, though wrapped in velvet and gold, died with them. By the fourth funeral, the physicians learned to speak less. They stopped offering timelines. They no longer said restoration or remission. They used vague phrases like constitutional fragility and imbalance of humours, the old phrases that meant little and saved less. And though none dared speak the word to the king, the court whispered it behind cupped hands, impotence, not of body, but of science. No cure for what the palace held, no balm for grief that calcified into silence. One young doctor, fresh from the universities, had dared to ask the unaskable. He'd said perhaps the cause was not in the body, but in the place, the air, the walls. Perhaps the palace itself held some unseen pestilence. He was dismissed within the hour. His name was never spoken again, and yet the suspicion clung. Servants burned lavender and rosemary beneath the beds. Old nurses stitched talismans into the hems of the children's robes. Some claimed to see shadows move across sick-room walls where no light flickered. Others said the mirrors near the royal bedchamber were covered not for modesty, but to keep something from looking back. The king kept them all, the doctors, the magicians, the clergy. He kept them on retainer like soldiers. But it was clear in his eyes that he no longer trusted them. Not really. Their presence was ritual, theatre, a performance of control when nothing remained to command. And still he summoned them. Because what else was there? What else can a man do when his every love wilts under his watch, but keep asking, what am I not seeing? What am I missing? What sickness survives my gold, my prayers, my gaze? He didn't know the answer. But the shadows watched him too, and they never blinked. She was the last. Everyone knew it, though no one said it aloud. Not in the throne room, not at court, not in the chambers, where silk-clad courtiers once spun gossip like lace. This time, there was no illusion, no spark of youthful hope, no distant alliance clothed in velvet and pearls. The fifth bride arrived already cloaked in inevitability. She was young, too young, chosen not because of her lineage, nor her wit, nor her political worth, but because she was willing, or perhaps because she didn't know better. Raised in the provinces, she had only heard the stories in fragments, distorted by distance. She thought them exaggerations, old wives' tales, spun to frighten naive girls from dreaming of palaces. She entered the gates smiling. She would not smile again. By then the court had stopped pretending. The music was quieter. The tapestries were darker. Even the banquet halls seemed to echo with dread rather than delight. The wedding was swift, efficient, and cold. The vows barely whispered. No feasts, no dancing, no laughter. The crown, once a symbol of power and eternity, now looked like a wreath woven for a grave. He tried at first. The king. He stood beside her, walked with her, sat near her in the garden and told stories of his childhood, the ones not yet stained by mourning, but his voice trembled with effort. His eyes flinched at every cough, every twitch of her hand. Love had become a kind of trauma for him, each kindness a prelude to burial, and she, sensing the hollowness beneath the ceremony, began to fade long before the fever set in. They said it was consumption, again, or maybe an inherited defect. The physician said many things, none of which mattered. The queen stopped eating, she stopped rising from bed, and the king stopped sleeping altogether. He sat beside her night after night, holding a hand that grew lighter each hour, not just in weight, but in presence, as if her soul was slowly learning how to disappear before the body gave out. He whispered nothing, not prayers, not reassurances, not apologies. What was left to say? On the seventh night she looked at him, truly looked at him, and asked, in the faintest breath, "Was I ever real to you?" He didn't answer, and she died. The funeral was silent, no procession, no public display, just a sealed casket, lowered beneath grey skies that refused even the decency of rain. When it was done, the king returned not to his bed, but to the throne room. He stood there, alone, for hours. Some said they saw him remove the crown and place it at his feet. Others claimed he whispered her name once, then nothing more. From that day forward, he ruled with the stiffness of a corpse. He ate alone, spoke rarely, smiled never. And though he remained alive, it was clear to all that the last queen had not been the only one buried that week. Because some men do not die by blade or poison. Some men die by love, one funeral at a time. And by the fifth, the crown had grown too heavy to wear. It had become a coffin, and he had been buried standing. The palace flew its flags at half-mast for the fifth time, but by now, no one looked up. Mourning had become routine, the way weather becomes background. Black veils flooded the streets, but they were thinner than before, more gesture than grief. The bells tolled, the cathedrals whispered mass, the papers printed solemn eulogies. Yet beneath the ritual of sorrow lay something rawer, quieter, more dangerous, dread. The people had begun to wonder if the king himself was cursed, not metaphorically, not poetically, but truly, cosmically. A king who could not keep a wife, who outlived every queen, whose throne seemed to kill what it touched. Superstition spread faster than ceremony. Farmers in the countryside refused to send their daughters to court, no matter how noble the invitation. Midwives began tying red thread around infants' wrists, claiming it would protect them from royal fate. Priests were stopped in the streets and asked whether divine punishment came in patterns, whether God could poison a bloodline, one bride at a time, and yet no one dared say it aloud. The king might be the source of it all. In public they spoke carefully. They praised his endurance, his faith, his tragic nobility. They wrote poems about sorrow and martyrdom and divine trial. They called him Job reborn, a monarch of ashes who still bore his sceptre. But in the taverns, in the kitchens, in the letters passed quietly between embassies, the tone was different. What man, they asked, could survive 5 funerals untouched? What husband did not break after so much death? Unless, of course, he had never been whole to begin. Whispers turned into folklore. Children began calling the palace the Widowmaker's Keep. Some said the king spoke to ghosts, that he wandered the garden at midnight, naming them, that he hadn't aged in years, as if grief had frozen him. Others whispered worse things, that he was a bringer of rot, that he consumed the vitality of his brides to extend his reign. Ridiculous things, impossible things, but things people believed because they needed something to believe. Inside the palace, servants lowered their voices to a whisper. Maids stepped lightly across creaking floors. Guards refused to linger near the Queen's wing after dusk. Even the court musicians tuned their instruments in silence, for no one had requested music in months. The throne was still occupied, the kingdom still functioned, but the air had changed. It smelled faintly of incense and iron and old closed rooms. The people no longer waited for the next queen, they waited for the end. Not of his reign, but of whatever spell had been cast, whatever story they were trapped inside. Because it no longer felt like they were ruled by a man. It felt like they were ruled by morning itself. At first it was just a shadow in the script of the kingdom, a footnote beneath the funerals, a quiet murmur in the mouths of those who dared speak around candlelight. But after the 5th queen was buried, the myth took root. And myths, unlike monarchs, do not age, they grow. There were those who said the king had broken a vow once, long ago, refused a marriage to a woman said to be blessed by the saints. Her family cursed him, and the curse bore fruit. Love turned to ash. Others told of a hidden chapel beneath the palace floor, sealed in stone, where an oath had been made to heaven and quietly broken. The story changed, depending on who told it, but the outcome was always the same. He had sinned, and the punishment had not come with swords or fire, but with grief that wore a wedding veil. The clergy tried to silence it. Decrees were issued. Pulpits reminded the faithful that kings were chosen by God, not judged by him. But even the bishops hesitated now when they looked the king in the eye. What if this was not divine right, but divine consequence? What if his crown had become a chalice, one he was forced to drink from, again and again, until even heaven pitied him? Then came the scandal. A letter smuggled from the royal physician's private drawer. No name, no seal, just words, scrawled in a hand too shaking to be false. It claimed the king had demanded a secret autopsy after the 3rd queen, that what they found in her lungs had no name in the medical texts, that the tissue was dark, brittle, like petals soaked in ink. The letter claimed it matched the 2nd queen, and the 4th, that no disease could explain it, that the bodies decayed too quickly, that one doctor had wept. The palace denied everything, called it treason, called it forgery. The letter's writer vanished, of course, but the people didn't care if it was true. It felt true. And truth, in an empire that runs on ritual and spectacle, is whatever story draws the most silence after it's told. Paintings of the king were altered subtly. Artists shaded his eyes deeper, as if they held something no light could touch. Coins still bore his profile, but fewer people carried them with pride. The legend spread beyond borders. Neighbouring kingdoms sent condolences instead of proposals. Some offered alliances, yes, but never daughters. Inside the palace he stopped sleeping in the royal chambers. Too many rooms remembered, too many deaths. He slept instead in a smaller wing, alone, beneath a plain wooden crucifix. No guards, no maids. He didn't ask for silence. Silence simply followed him. Because now, whether he lived or died, whether he ruled or vanished, the myth had already won. And what terrified the kingdom most was that maybe he had too. He stopped speaking in complete sentences. Not at first. In the beginning, it was subtle. Trails of thought abandoned mid-sentence. Eyes wandering to corners where nothing moved. Ministers would present him with documents, and he would nod without reading. Or he would read the same line twice, then ask why it hadn't been brought to him yet. He seemed to forget names, then birthdays, then entire people. The silence that had followed him after the funerals now moved inside him. At court, they called it exhaustion. Privately, they whispered of madness. He began pacing more than ruling, wandering the same corridor in his private wing, until the floorboards groaned under the repetition. Sometimes he muttered prayers, sometimes the names of his wives, sometimes just numbers. No one knew what they meant. 7, 11, 14, over and over. One night, a servant overheard him say, "How many times must she die?" He was alone in the chamber when he said it. The royal physicians returned, though not at his request. They came with their charts, their probes, their theories. They diagnosed melancholy, spiritual crisis. One dared call it decay of the royal faculties. That man was dismissed the next morning, escorted out by soldiers who wouldn't meet his eyes. But the truth was harder to exile. He no longer ate with others, no longer left his wing. When he appeared in public, it was with an eerie stillness, his face blank, his hands unmoving, as though the body remained, but the soul had grown tired of being seen. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was with the cadence of memory rather than command. He once asked a diplomat if his wife was well, unaware she had died a decade earlier. At another meeting, he offered a toast to the Queen, with no name spoken, no explanation given. Some said he had begun writing letters, dozens of them, folded and stored in a locked chest. No one knew their content, no one dared ask, but a maid claimed to have seen him weeping over one. Not crying, weeping. The kind of collapse that comes only when the mind cannot carry its own weight anymore. There were rumours of voices, of footsteps in his chamber when no one was inside, of the king asking to speak to his late wife before falling asleep, and smiling as though she'd replied. But even the whispers grew quiet over time, because what could they say that he didn't already wear on his face? He had become sovereign of absence, ruler of a country built from echoes. His crown sat untouched, his throne stood cold, and in the end, power had not corrupted him. It had eroded him, like stone left in the rain too long, until all that remained was the shape of a king, haunted by the throne he still sat upon. By the time winter arrived, the palace no longer felt alive. It creaked like an old ship stranded on land, its sails long torn down, its decks haunted by the memory of movement. Every hallway had the hush of a church with no congregation. The candles burned shorter now, not because they were trimmed, but because fewer dared to light them. Light meant shadows, and in this palace, shadows remembered everything. The king no longer roamed the state chambers. His footsteps, once a symbol of presence, had vanished, and in their absence the air grew heavy. Rooms remained untouched for weeks, months. Chairs stayed tucked, mirrors remained covered, and curtains never drawn back. Dust didn't settle. It waited, like a hush before a sermon. Even the birds in the rafters flew away. The silence was not just imposed, it was inherited, passed like a sickness through marble and brick. The portraits of the queens still lined the western gallery. No one dared remove them. Their eyes seemed to follow you, but not in judgment, in mourning. Painted smiles half faded, posthumous attempts to frame tragedy in elegant. Beneath each portrait, a plaque, the name, the title, the year of death. 5 brass plates polished endlessly by trembling servants, as if keeping them clean could prevent a 6th. Visitors noticed. Diplomats returned with reports that the palace had turned strange, sombre. One said it felt more like a tomb than a seat of power. Another, more poetically, described it as a cathedral for women who could no longer sing. Foreign queens who once might have visited now sent only letters, carefully worded condolences wrapped in fear. No daughter would be sent here, no match arranged. The king was not alone because he ruled without love. He was alone because love had died too many times under his roof. Servants began leaving, quietly, discreetly. Footmen who had served 2 generations simply stopped showing up. Maids broke contract and vanished into countryside inns. Even the cooks claimed the lard spoiled faster now, that food lost flavour once it crossed the palace threshold. A single rumour said that a nursemaid saw one of the late queen's veils flutter in a room with no wind. That was enough. Fear doesn't need proof, it only needs repetition. The gardens overgrew, the fountains cracked, and inside the throne room, the air didn't echo anymore, because echoes require sound, and this palace had run out of voices. He still sat there, the king, occasionally, when his limbs would carry him, cloaked not in velvet, but in memories too dense to shed. He no longer looked at the throne as a symbol. He looked at it the way one looks at a gravestone that bears one's own name, because this was no longer a kingdom of living people, it was a throne of ghosts, and he was their final witness. There had once been so many plans, so many scrolls, so many charts with lines drawn in ink and blood mapping the kingdom's future through generations not yet born. The dynasty had been a monument, vast, immovable, inevitable. But after the fifth queen's death, the ink began to fade, and the bloodlines thinned like parchment left too long in the sun. The king had children. Of course he did. Each queen had left behind a piece of us, a son here, a daughter there, but their presence only emphasized the absence. They walked the palace with the posture of orphans, raised by governesses and grief, shaped more by funerals than festivals. They didn't speak of their mothers. They didn't speak much at all. The court called them regal. In truth, they were afraid to be anything else. And the question everyone asked, but no one dared put to voice, was this: who would rule next? Who among them could bear the weight of a crown soaked in mourning? Whose blood hadn't curdled under the shadow of the throne? The eldest son was the obvious heir, tall, reserved, ceremonial in his movements, but his eyes gave him away. They darted like a boy, constantly waiting for something to fall. He rarely touched others, refused to marry, and once, during a dinner with foreign delegates, he looked directly at his father and asked, "Does the crown choose the sacrifice, or do we offer it?" He wasn't invited to state dinners after that. The second son was rumoured mad. He wrote poetry in the margins of ledgers, spoke in riddles during hunting parties, and once attempted to bless the stables with holy oil. The clergy claimed it was divine inspiration. The court called it instability. The staff called it foreshadowing. The daughters were more beloved by the people, but they, too, bore the curse. One took a vow of silence after her mother's death. Another married into a distant house across the sea and died in childbirth before she could ever return. Scandal followed the vacuum. Nobles whispered of illegitimate children, of bastard claimants raised in secret. One tabloid suggested the king had sired a hidden heir with a foreign maid. Another accused a bishop of plotting to place his own blood on the throne. Each rumour was denied, but each denial came slower, and through it all the king said nothing. He watched his legacy unravel in silence, as if the very idea of a future had become too distant to grasp. He had once believed in a line that stretched beyond his own death, but now the line was buckling, folding in on itself like a dying vine. What was a dynasty if every branch carried grief? What was a throne if no one wanted to inherit it? He kept a portrait of the first queen in his private study. It was cracked, faded, forgotten by most, but he looked at it often, as if in her quiet eyes he saw not just memory, but the end of everything he'd tried to build. He lived longer than anyone expected. That was the cruelest part. The fifth funeral should have been the end. Many thought he would follow soon after, collapse from the weight of grief, slip away in the night like a man too tired to keep breathing. But he didn't die. He endured. Not out of will, or strength, or hope. He simply kept going, the way a clock keeps ticking in an empty room. The palace didn't rejoice in his longevity. It recoiled from it. He no longer ruled, not really. Decisions were made in adjacent chambers, by ministers who walked on eggshells, and signed documents in his name with hands that trembled. He would sit at the edge of council meetings, uninvited but present, staring past them all. Occasionally, he would speak, a murmur about treaties a decade old, a law that had already been repealed, or a name no one recognised. They would nod, write it down, and move on. It was easier that way. No one spoke of his mind aloud, but the signs were there. He would disappear for hours and be found in the old Queen's chambers, sitting in the dark beside a bed that hadn't been used in years. He once had a servant arrested for entering the room with a broom, accusing him of disturbing, arresting presence. The man was released by morning. The king had forgotten the incident entirely. There were days, entire days, where he would not speak at all, just walk or sit or stare out a frost-covered window. When he did speak, it was usually to someone who wasn't there. Whispered conversations with ghosts, regrets passed through clenched teeth, prayers with no God left to hear them. His words came slowly now, like each one had to be unearthed from within, and he had hardened too. Not in cruelty, he no longer had the energy for anger, but in detachment. Children were brought to him sometimes, out of duty. He barely looked at them. Courtiers bowed and he didn't raise his head. When a bishop tried to comfort him with a sermon about divine design, the king simply replied, "Then God is a butcher." That was the last sermon. He ate alone, slept alone, dreamed alone, but he wasn't alone in the true sense of the word. The palace was filled with the weight of what he had lost. The quiet of his chambers pulsed with invisible company, and in his final years, he seemed not to live within his body, but beside it, like a man lingering in the ruins of himself. Sometimes at dusk, servants reported hearing a voice drifting through the halls, not commanding, not grieving, singing, a soft lullaby, in a language no one remembered. It would stop when anyone approached, but they were sure it was him, and they were sure it wasn't. He didn't die with a crown on his head. He died in a chair, watching the snow fall, outside a window too high to open. When they found him, his hand was open, as if he'd finally let go of something too heavy to carry into the next world. They didn't notice at first. The king's absence was not unusual anymore. By his final year, entire days passed without a servant laying eyes on him. Meals were left untouched outside his door, fires stoked by hands that never saw his shadow. And so when the silence stretched longer than usual, the palace didn't panic, it simply waited. But on the third day, a chambermaid entered with trembling hands and found him sitting upright in the carved wooden chair beside the window. Snow had collected on the sill, but none had melted against the glass. His eyes were half open, unfocused. He looked almost thoughtful, except for the stillness, that terrible, complete stillness. A physician was summoned, then another, and another. But there was no doubt, not even the polite kind. The king was gone, and all he left behind was quiet. The bells didn't ring right away. The kingdom had to be told gently, as if breaking news to someone already in mourning. There was no procession that day, no parade of banners, no trumpet, only the soft tolling of one distant bell swallowed by the snow. But the real grief, the real confusion, wasn't just that the king had died. It was that no one knew what had died with him. There was no final speech, no last letter, no sealed scroll to be opened by his heir. His journals were empty, his desk cleared save for a single candle burned to the nub. The locked chest of letters he had once wept over had vanished. The royal archivists said nothing had been removed. The staff swore no one had seen it carried out. But it was gone, just gone. And then came the question. It was a simple one, but it clawed at the kingdom like a blade made of silence. Why had his queens died? It should have faded with time, but it didn't. The question infected poems, infiltrated sermons, clung to gossip like perfume to lace. Was it illness? Was it divine punishment? Was it grief made manifest? Did he love them too much, or not enough? Did something in the palace feed on them? Did he know? Had he chosen them because they were fated to die? Or had they died because he chose them? Some said his death was proof he'd never known the answer. Others said it was the only reason he could finally go, because he had found it, and it had destroyed him. A new monarch would rise, of course. A crown would be passed. But the question did not pass with it. It lingered, like smoke after a fire. Generations later, historians debated it. Playwrights reimagined it. Children whispered about it. And the throne itself? It remained in its place, cold, waiting, because no one ever sat in that old chair again. Not out of fear, but out of reverence, as if the man who died there had taken something unspeakable with him and left behind the echo of a truth no one ever wanted to find. The mourning was orchestrated with precision. Black drapes unfurled from palace windows. Clergy robed in shadow offered their hollow prayers, and the streets were lined with onlookers who bowed their heads, more out of obligation than sorrow. The people knew how to grieve a monarch. What they did not know was how to grieve this monarch. There were no stirring proclamations of legacy, no grand declarations of what he had meant, because no one knew. His reign had not ended in triumph nor tragedy, but in confusion, a long descent into shadows from which no meaning had clearly emerged. The official statements were brief, sterile. His Majesty passed peacefully in his chambers. No mention of the years of silence, the vanished letters, the wives buried like chapters in a forgotten book. In the provinces, people asked questions. Not loudly, never loudly, but they asked. What had happened in that palace? Why had no queen survived it? What sin had gone unnamed? What sickness unspoken? There were rumours of a curse, of course. Every era needs its ghosts. Some blamed the architecture, claiming the foundations had been laid on desecrated ground. Others insisted the royal bloodline had been touched by divine punishment. Too much pride, too little repentance. But most, in their private thoughts, simply wondered if they would ever know the truth. The new monarch, young, uncertain, visibly cautious, did not linger in the old palace. He moved the court to a smaller estate in the countryside. More modest, more modern. He claimed it was for efficiency, but everyone understood it was fear. That throne, that hallway, that window where the king had died, they were all left untouched. The doors were closed, the rooms sealed. A mausoleum, not of a man, but of questions. Historians descended, of course. They catalogued what they could. They opened drawers, dusted shelves, read letters not meant to survive. But nothing answered the question. There were no damning confessions, no traces of poison, no royal diaries riddled with regret. Just fragments, half-written poems, discarded portraits, the faint smell of perfume lingering on unused linen. And still, the kingdom moved on. It always does. Crops were planted, wars debated, taxes collected, but underneath it all was a sense, an ache, that something had broken beneath that crown, not shattered with noise, but worn away with time. And in that erosion, something essential had gone missing. No bells marked the anniversary of his death. No statues were built, just a portrait hung in a lesser hall, eyes heavy, mouth thin. A man remembered not for his glory, but for the silence he left behind. A king had died, and in his place a kingdom remained, bereft, bewildered, and still waiting for the answer. At first he was simply forgotten. There was no great statue, no national holiday, no epic poems etched into marble. The king whose wives died one by one was quietly folded into the pages of history with a whisper rather than a proclamation. Official portraits were moved to the less travelled wings of museums. Textbooks spared him a few paragraphs, always vague, always delicate. His reign was remembered not for victories or reforms, but for something else, something heavier. But history, like grief, does not remain still. As the years passed, as generations turned and dust settled over the cold facts, a legend began to take shape. Not from truth, but from discomfort, from the human need to explain what disturbs us. They called him the Mourning King. They said he wore black from the moment his first queen died until his final breath, that he spoke to her ghost in the hallways, lit a candle each night at the foot of her portrait, that the palace mirrors were covered not to preserve modesty, but to keep him from seeing the eyes of his dead wives staring back through his own. None of it was confirmed, and yet it felt true, because it was easier than the alternative, that he was simply a man who watched the people he loved vanish one after another, without meaning or mercy, that the most powerful man in the land could do nothing to stop the slow march of grief, that some fates are not shaped by sin or sacrifice or prophecy, but by nothing at all. But legends do not feed on nothing. They require symbols. So the king became a symbol of cursed love, of tragic nobility. Plays were written where he was recast as a romantic, a man too devoted, too consumed by grief to rule. In some he was penitent, in others insane. One version insisted he poisoned each queen with his own hands, unable to endure their eventual deaths. Another insisted he had been cursed by a midwife whose daughter he had once ignored. None of it was real, but it made sense, and sense is often more seductive than truth. The man himself, what little was known of him, was buried beneath the story. His silences were interpreted as wisdom, his absences as dignity. His final years, spent hollow and haunted, were described as solemn contemplation. It was more comfortable that way, to make him poetic, tragic, misunderstood. It excused the kingdom's fear, it justified the quiet, it allowed the crown to endure, because a man who breaks beneath sorrow is terrifying. But a legend can be mourned, romanticized, forgiven, and so the king was rewritten, not with malice, not even with intent, but with necessity, pain made palatable, a myth born not from what he was, but from what we needed him to be. And in the end, perhaps that was the final cruelty, that the only peace he found was in being remembered as someone he never truly was. There is a room in the National Archives, quiet, low-lit, unremarkable to the untrained eye, where the files on the Mourning King are kept under lock and key, not because they contain state secrets or dangerous truths, but because no one knows quite what to make of them. The fragments left behind by a man who buried 5 queens and never spoke of why continue to trouble even the most rational minds. Scholars pore over scraps of letters, physician notes, servant testimonies, and the maddeningly vague royal decrees that became his hallmark. but they don't find clarity, they find shadows. And in those shadows, 3 ghosts continue to walk. Curse, coincidence, and crime. The curse theory is the most romantic and the most enduring. It began in whispers, but centuries have not silenced it. That perhaps the royal line had, somewhere deep in its blood-soaked ancestry, offended something older than the crown, a desecrated relic, a spurned priestess, a pact broken in the dark, something mythic, something ancient, and that the cost of that arrogance was the Queen's chair becoming a death sentence. Supporters of this theory point to the eerily similar patterns in each death: the suddenness, the isolation, the final hours described in oddly matching terms, eyes open, hands reaching for something unseen. They note the candles that wouldn't stay lit in the chapel, the nursery where no child ever slept more than a few weeks. They even reference the blackbird said to perch on the palace spire the night before each death. No one can prove it, but no one can explain it either. Then there are the rationalists, the historians who favour coincidence. Tragedy, they argue, does not need intention to be devastating. Perhaps it was illness, poor hygiene, childbirth complications, undiagnosed hereditary conditions. Maybe the palace's air was tainted. Maybe the king's bloodline was simply unlucky or weak, or both. They dismiss the eerie similarities as the brain's pattern-seeking reflex. In overdrive, bad luck, a perfect storm. But even they, in quieter moments, admit the coincidence feels too perfect. The statistics don't lie, but neither do the chills they feel reading, the coroner's conflicting accounts, or the way each queen's health began to fail shortly after marriage. And then there are those who whisper crime. Not officially, of course. No one dares accuse a king, even centuries after his death. But the theory is there, lurking like rot beneath marble, that perhaps the deaths were not fate, nor divine design, but murder. That someone close, perhaps a physician, perhaps a rival noble, perhaps even the king himself, engineered these tragedies, slowly, quietly, with poison in doses small enough to mimic wasting disease, or through emotional cruelty so profound it eroded the body from within. These theorists fixate on the gaps in court records, the missing diary pages, the inexplicably erased entries in the servants' logs. They point to the one physician who served all 5 queens, and then retired abruptly, disappearing from all public record. They point to the queen who, before her final breath, allegedly whispered, "He knew." There is no proof. There never was. Just a lingering unease. Just the way the air feels colder in that part of the archive. Just the way people lean in when you tell them the story, as if they need to know, need to believe there was a reason, any reason, for something so bleak. But in the end, the files offer no final answer. Only that 5 women died, and the man who survived them left the truth buried deeper than any of their bones. They were never meant to be read. The diaries, the letters, the hastily scribbled notes, tucked into prayer books and coat linings, none of them were written for history. They were confessions to the void, scratches of fear etched by people who had nowhere else to speak, because in that palace, truth was not something you shared. It was something you carried like a secret illness, passed only in glances, in trembling hands, in ink that faded too quickly. For centuries, these writings were hidden, suppressed, destroyed where possible. But paper has a strange way of surviving, especially when it's soaked in dread. And slowly, quietly, these fragments have surfaced, scraps of the world behind the crown. A court that smiled by day and whispered through gritted teeth at night. One maid who served 2 queens wrote of the air in the west wing that made her chest tighten and her dreams strange. She described the queen's nightly headaches, how they worsened after visits with a particular apothecary. Another entry simply said, she wept when he kissed her hand, not because she loved him, because she knew. A footman recorded a different kind of terror. He wrote of the king's silence, not cruelty, not wrath, but silence so deep it changed the room. That when a queen spoke too freely at dinner, the king's eyes didn't narrow, they simply dulled, and within weeks, her appetite waned. Her skin paled, her voice thinned. He never raised a hand, the footman wrote, but she still vanished. And then there were the doctor's notes. They're the most chilling of all, not because of what they say, but what they avoid. Repeated mentions of hysteria, of female frailty, of spiritual melancholia, none of them precise, all of them deflection, One physician listed the cause of death for the third queen as exhaustion of the soul. Another claimed the fifth succumbed to delicate nerves, while privately, in his own pocket journal, he scribbled the words, "This is not a disease I know." There are gaps in the official record that stretch for weeks, pages torn from ledgers, whole entries replaced with ink blots and wax smears. Once, a court scribe wrote 5 lines about the Queen's condition. The next morning, all but the first sentence had been blacked out, and the scribe was reassigned to the stables. And the king? He never wrote a single word, not that anyone has found. No letters, no journals, no final thoughts, just silence, as if his entire soul had gone underground, buried beneath protocol and prayer. What the court knew, what they felt, was not spoken aloud, but it seeped through the walls. It lingered on doorknobs and in pillow seams. It filled the silence between clinks of silverware and the rustling of veils. They didn't speak because they couldn't, or because they knew that if they did, they might be next. They were queens, yes, but not just queens. Before the crowns, before the gold-threaded gowns and stiff ceremonial poses, they were women, daughters, sisters, friends. And after their deaths, long after the mourning curtains had been drawn and the official portraits commissioned, there were those who still remembered them, not as titles but as people. People who laughed in the early mornings, who sang in languages that no one in the court understood, who pressed lavender sachets into sleeves and left behind whispers of perfume in the air. Each wife brought something different to the palace, and each left behind an absence shaped like a scream no one was allowed to hear. The first queen was said to be bright-eyed and endlessly curious, a scholar's daughter, fluent in ancient texts, who arrived with books under her arm and fire in her voice. She was not bred for obedience, but tried to mould herself into it anyway. One of her handmaidens wrote years later that the light in her eyes dimmed like a candle under glass, and that even before her illness began, something in her spirit had been choked by the quiet cold of the palace. After her death, her library was sealed, and none of her volumes were ever seen again. The second was younger, softer spoken, more cautious, but she loved music. She played the harp in secret, refusing to let court protocol erase that part of her. Servants once found her barefoot in the corridor, humming a lullaby from her childhood. When she fell ill, she insisted it was nothing. Even as her hands trembled, she smiled, until one night she asked to be taken to the garden and collapsed before she reached the threshold. The palace chapel still refuses to grow lilies where she last stood. The third tried to change things. She questioned. She resisted. She pushed back against silence with measured poise and unrelenting grace. Some say she got too close to the truth, that her sudden decline wasn't natural. A court letter from her lady-in-waiting, unsigned, unsent, contained only 7 words. She found the reason, and it killed her. The fourth queen was kind. That was the word used most often, kind. She was said to notice servants who had no names, to thank cooks and stable boys with equal regard. She left gifts in others' rooms. She tried to bring warmth, and maybe that's why her death was the hardest to bear. The entire palace fell quiet for a month afterward, as if ashamed to keep going. And the fifth, she was radiant, a flame that burned too quickly. She arrived like a sunrise after a year of storm. Her laughter filled halls that hadn't known joy in decades. Some believed she might survive the pattern, break the cycle, rewrite the ending. But fate, or something else, had other plans. Now they are remembered only in pieces, in faded embroidery on a hem, in the hush that falls when their portraits are dusted, in the strange way the palace echoes at night, like someone is still walking the halls, searching for something they left behind. The wives were not just victims, they were warnings, and somewhere, behind every veil draped over their memories, the truth still waits, fragile, aching, and begging not to be forgotten. The blood didn't wash away, not from the bed linens, not from the chamber floors, and not from the lineage that followed. Long after the mourning king was laid to rest, long after the last candle flickered out in the mausoleum of his reign, the stain of his sorrow remained etched into the crown itself, quiet but unshakable. His tragedy wasn't just personal, it was hereditary, a legacy of grief handed down like a cursed jewel. His heirs carried more than his name. They carried his silence. The first successor was a boy grown brittle under the weight of shadows. Raised by governesses who whispered stories they were never meant to repeat, he learned early that love was something that could vanish without explanation. His letters as a teenager were filled with apologies to no one in particular for nothing specific, just a learned instinct to apologize, to anticipate abandonment. When he ascended the throne, he spoke little in public and married late, if at all. Rumours swirled, as they always do, but the truth was simpler, sadder. He did not know how to be close to another human being without fearing they would fade before his eyes. And so the royal line hardened. Subsequent monarchs became obsessed with appearance, with rituals, with protocol so rigid it verged on the absurd. Anything to keep chaos at bay, anything to avoid the unpredictability of real emotion. Weddings became performative. Love was a risk few dared to take. Some married only for politics, others not at all. Children were raised by tutors, not parents. Affection was written out of the royal vocabulary, replaced by duty. Distance became the monarchy's defining trait. But the tragedy still bled through. In the uncanny resemblance each new queen bore to the last. In the haunting lullabies sung in royal nurseries, passed down without origin. In the royal physicians, who were vetted not just for skill, but for silence. In the locked wing of the old palace that no one entered, still untouched from the day the fifth queen died, the air inside thick with forgotten breath. Whispers of the curse never died either. Each generation faced rumours, miscarriages linked to the dying line, sudden illnesses, psychological fragility, and always the question, was it beginning again? Was the wound that first opened in the king's heart still bleeding in the veins of his descendants? Some historians claim the tragedy made the monarchy more cautious, more calculating, more removed from the people it claimed to represent. Others argue it bred resilience, that surviving such loss reshaped the crown into something quieter but stronger. But those closest to the royal blood know the truth is neither. The tragedy didn't end, it simply changed form. It became a shadow that stood beside every new queen, whispering promises of devotion laced with dread. It became a silence in the royal corridors, a habit of checking one's breath in the morning, just in case it might be the last. It became a lineage not just of power, but of inherited sorrow, a blood-stained line. And though the ink on history's official records remains dry and composed, the deeper story seeps between the pages, because every crown forged in grief still echoes with the sound of 5 final breaths. History tends to smooth the edges. It scrubs the grime from marble statues, polishes the portraits, rewrites the lullabies. It tells us kings are strong, queens are beautiful, and death is always dignified. But beneath that curated silence lies a truth far messier and far more human. This king, this man who stood at the heart of an empire, surrounded by wealth, bowed to by thousands, spent his reign slowly, helplessly, watching the light leave the eyes of the women he called wife. Not once, not twice, but 5 times. Each loss carved deeper into his soul, until even the crown seemed to sag under the weight. His was not a story of scandal, of beheadings, or betrayal, but of something darker in its quietness. The kind of grief that repeats itself until it becomes ritual. We often imagine monarchs as untouchable, armoured by lineage, preserved by duty. But what happens when the throne itself becomes a coffin? When every marriage ends in mourning? When the most powerful man in the realm becomes a witness to decay over and over again? He began as a husband. He ended as a relic, a ghost seated on velvet, haunted not by war, but by the soft absence of love that stayed. The tragedy became myth. The myth became warning. And the warning still lingers, not just in history books, not just in museums, but in the way we speak of legacy, of lineage, of duty at the expense of joy, in the quiet expectation that power must come with sacrifice, and that some lives, often women's lives, are meant to disappear behind veils and titles. We remember his name, but we barely remember theirs, yet their echoes remain, in the silent rooms of royal palaces, in the trembling hands of brides stepping into old gowns, in the hush that follows the question no one dares to ask, did he love them, or did he fear what loving them might cost? The king is gone. His line, twisted by time, wears different robes now, but the silence he left behind hasn't ended. It waits, it watches, and it reminds us, always, that even in the grandest halls, death does not knock once. It rings the bell again, and again and again,